I wanted to go through Zelensky's peace plan. Zelensky has gone around Europe and the United States showing this plan to Biden, showing this plan to Vice President Harris, showing this plan to presidential candidate Donald Trump, showing this plan to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Olaf Scholz of Germany, I believe, and a few other countries. I forget everyone. And the reason of going around and showing everyone this plan is to show Western countries that are supporting Ukraine that Ukraine still has a path forward towards something that resembles a victory, towards forcing the Russians into a position through battlefield losses, increased support, and otherwise to accept a peace deal that they wouldn't accept otherwise, that gives Ukraine much more leverage. So they'd be able to reclaim territory, they'd be able to assert sovereignty, they'd be able to join organizations like NATO that would give them collective defense and stop invasions like this in the future. So it's giving Ukraine the force and the leverage in order to force the Russians to negotiate on Ukrainian terms. Seems to be the general direction or purpose of the plan. And there's 5 points to it that he now for the first time revealed to the public, because previously this was private, and it was private out of concerns that revealing all the parts of the plan, which they still haven't revealed every part of the plan, I imagine, but just like a watered down version for the public. The reason they didn't want to show it to the public is they were worried that the Russians could then like prepare in some way to counteract it, and that there's certain details of it that could be useful for the Russians, and therefore they've kept it private. But now we were getting some public version of it, of course probably watered down, but some public version of it. Degenerate Liberty, thank you for reposting your song in site chat. Bloodblade, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. I appreciate that, buddy. So let's watch Zelensky talk to the Ukrainian Rada, which is their parliament, presenting this plan for the first time to the public. This is from UATV English. It's Ukrainian state TV, but translated into English.
План перемоги, щоб примусити Росію.
We must implement the victory plan to force Russia to attend the peace summit and be ready to end the war. So, the plan...
When they say peace summit, Ukraine had this peace summit earlier this year where he had all these different countries come together, many of which then endorsed a peace plan, which Ukraine put forward that calls for Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine and has a bunch of conditions. For example, them getting control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, ceasing of attacks on civilian infrastructure, and otherwise that would help lead to a pathway towards peace. The Russians, while there were some that wanted to invite the Russians, I believe the Germans talked about it for a small period of time, the Russians flat out refused to participate. The Ukrainians have said that they will be invited, the Russians will be invited for future conferences, probably so they'd be able to, from the Ukrainian perspective, negotiate from a position of strength at one of these places where many of Ukraine's allies will be there to support them and back them up. But the Russians have altogether rejected that as an idea. That doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just that they're, Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, continues to say oh, this is delusion. And apparently their reaction to this, and I can just tell you in advance before we get into it, was that Zelensky needs to sober up. So they did not take this 5-point plan very well in Moscow, in the Kremlin.
To attend the peace summit and be ready to end the war. So, the plan consists of 5 points and 3 secret annexes. Point 1 is geopolitical. Points 2 and 3 are military. Point 4 is economic. Point 5 of the victory plan is security. The points are timed. The first 4 are for the duration of the war to end it. The 5th point is for the time after the war to guarantee security. The first is an invitation to join NATO. We are a democratic nation that has proven that it can defend the Euro-Atlantic and our common way of life, other democratic nations. For decades, Russia has been exploiting geopolitical uncertainty in Europe, namely the fact that Ukraine is not a NATO member. This is what tempted Russia to encroach on our security. Now, the fact that Ukraine is invited to join NATO can be truly fundamental to peace. We understand that NATO membership is a matter of the future, not the present. But Putin must see that his geopolitical calculations are losing.
So his statement seems to be that part 1 is Ukraine joining NATO, because A, it ensures them long-term security, because Russia didn't invade Estonia, it didn't invade Latvia, it didn't invade Lithuania, it didn't invade all these other countries that his justification for the invasion of Ukraine could extend to in many ways. as these post-Soviet, these post-Soviet states that left the Russian sphere, many of whom has been in either the Russian Empire before or have, or in some instances, both, large populations of Russian speakers. Which, I mean, if you were to line up these different justifications for why they invaded Ukraine, you could find that used to invade these countries. They haven't been invaded. Even though there's been a lot of threats and talk, they haven't been invaded because it would trigger Article 5 and it would be a war with an alliance of over 1 billion people. And so that protection that was afforded to them was not afforded to Ukraine, even though they were given the Budapest Memorandum, which was obviously not as strong as Article 5 protections. And all the paper means nothing if there's not force behind it. So the first thing is long-term stability. But the other part is if the Russians sees Ukraine joining NATO and they see that as unable to stop, that they can't stop it, then they have to come to the conclusion, at least this is Zelensky's bet, that this goal of theirs is failing, that they're not going to be able to drag Ukraine away from the West geopolitically, and therefore they need to strike that demand for either a neutral Ukraine or a pro-Russia Ukraine from their list of demands.
Russians must feel it, that their Tsar has lost geopolitically. I thank all our partners who support that an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO now, with membership later, strengthens everyone. An invitation is a strong decision that requires nothing but determination. And today, the invitation symbolizes much more than just NATO. For Ukraine, decisiveness of the NATO issue also means the inevitability of European integration for Ukraine and the fact that there is no alternative to democracy in Ukraine. That is why this is the initial point of the victory plan. It is a sign of determination, an unconditional invitation now.
An unconditional invitation now, which somebody in chat, Sepson, just asked me about how realistic this is. I don't think that it's realistic that countries like Turkey and Hungary are going to accept Ukrainian NATO membership now, but if they start progressing the admission process, if they continue to speed up Ukraine going in its NATO standardization when it comes to its artillery systems, its artillery shells and ammunition, it applying to NATO standards, while also making clear that the only end for this war is Ukrainian NATO membership, and that when the paper is signed, Ukraine will be part of NATO, that strengthens their position on that in negotiations for the Russians, with the Russians. And so even if they end up not getting NATO membership, they could, presumably, even though of course we're assuming many things here and we're guessing about negotiations that could be months to years away, if they were to give it up, they could give it up for something else, i.e., fine, we won't join NATO, we'll have this multilateral defense pact instead, or a defense pact with this one country here and this one country here, but in return, you need to give us back X, Y, and Z territory, or X, Y, and the security guarantee, or whatever it is.
This is a certainty of how the partners really see Ukraine's place in the security architecture. I ask all of you to work for the partners' determination to recognize Ukraine as an equal in the European security architecture. The second point is defense. This is the irreversible strengthening of Ukraine's defense against the aggressor. It is realistic to defend our positions on the battlefield in Ukraine and at the same time bring the war back to Russia, so that Russians can really feel what war is, and despite Russian propaganda, start turning their hatred towards the Kremlin. We are not naive. Ukraine does not and will not believe that most Russians will realize the depths of Russia's moral decline. But they must feel the fall of the Russian army. And this will be a defeat for their ideology of war. There is a clear list of weapons that can support such a force of our soldiers, and thanks to the Kursk operation we have seen that Putin does not have enough strength to hold on when we press really hard. Therefore, the key to implementing this second point of the victory plan is successful continuation of operations by the defense and security forces of Ukraine in designated areas of enemy territory to prevent buffer zones on our land.
Okay, so this is interesting too, because if you remember, J.D. Vance was talking about like demilitarized kind of buffer zone areas too in his peace plan. Anyway, it seems to me that Zelensky is indicating that in order to achieve a just peace, it's going to mean continued strikes inside Russia, bringing the war more and more to Russia. So strikes on their factories, strikes on ammo ammunition storage, strikes on logistics and rail lines, strikes on oil refineries in order to undercut their ability to fund the war, strikes on air defense systems, maybe even strikes on localized electricity grids near the front that are being used to support military operations. There's a good chance it would also be ones that are away from the front. Either they could use it, say the justification could be, well, it's to knock out their air defense systems, which could be true, but it could also be just to show Russians that the war is coming home. And through all these strikes, largely through long-range UAVs, but if they're able to get permission, maybe that could be extended to within 300 to like 350 kilometers of the border for American weapons, like the ATACMS, if they were able to get approval, or domestically made longer-range missiles that the Ukrainians could use to try to pack more punch on strikes on air bases, which currently they're using drones to strike and they're making some progress on, but they just don't have large enough warheads to be able to destroy all of these different planes that are going to have some covers over them, concrete covers, in order to protect them. And there's so many of these concrete covers that you don't know which ones have planes and which ones don't. So it's better to pack a bigger punch so you can hit the most of these at the same time, have the wider spread of damage, and try to take out more of these aircrafts that are striking Ukrainian military and civilian infrastructure. So it seems to be that the Ukrainians believe that they need to take the war to Russia, which, by the way, if you apply this to NATO standards, and last question was about NATO, NATO's war planning with Russia, all of it includes long-range strikes into Russia in order to cut off Russia's like logistical capacity and their capacity to make war, making Russia's gigantic size, which is an asset when it comes to the amount of resources they can gather, the amount of people that they can gather, the amount of resources at their disposal, how much land they can presumably retreat into if they were invaded, turning it into a disadvantage because you got to transport stuff from across the whole country. And if you break out that transportation system, you make it so they can't fly all these planes or you can't run all these rail lines, then you've broken down the logistics. And if you don't have logistics for your army, well, you don't have much of an army. And NATO's war planning includes these strikes to achieve that goal. And so for NATO to have one war plan which it recognizes is effective or possibly useful to defeat Russia because it's its war plan, but then wanting Ukraine to abide and play by different rules when it comes to Western weapon or its strikes inside Russia, it's not necessarily contradictory because some will just say don't use our weapons, but it's okay for you to use your own. But others were against it in its entirety, saying it was a bad idea that you should just strike Russia where they are in Ukraine, while also holding that if they were to go to war with Russia, of course they'd strike deep into Russia. That's NATO's war plan. So it seems a little, from the ground here in Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainians are not appreciative of those, what they say is a double standard at times.
Irreversible strengthening of the positions of the defense and security forces of Ukraine and destruction of Russia's offensive potential in the occupied territory of Ukraine. Assistance from partners in manning reserve brigades for the armed forces of Ukraine. Bringing Ukraine's air defense system to a level of sufficient protection of our cities and villages from Russian missiles and drones, and joint defense.
By the way, this is not only important for the protection of civilians, but if there's going to be these Western investments in Ukrainian domestic production, in armor, or artillery, or any of these, they're going to need air defense systems to protect that buildup. Part of the reason defense companies are scared of investing in Ukraine is when you invest in infrastructure in a country that's being bombed, what happens when that investment goes up in smoke because it was bombed? And if you add a stronger air defense shield, for example, and this is just an example, like Israel has with its David Sling, its Iron Dome, it's not just the Iron Dome, there's multiple layers to it, then you could possibly allow for more foreign investment in Ukraine's domestic artillery production, which will not then be constrained by the same political sways of artillery production or weapons production in other countries.
Operations with our neighbors in Europe to shoot down Russian missiles and drones within the range of our partners' air shield. Expanding operations using...
This is something that if they can convince one country to do, might spill over to other countries, but also has many Western leaders concerned because the idea of NATO jets or NATO air defense systems knocking down rockets or missiles over the border in Ukraine, they could see as a direct involvement between our military forces and their military forces that could be escalatory. I would say, though, this would probably be the Ukrainian perspective, or maybe even the Romanian and Polish perspective, multiple Russian drones and rockets and missiles have crossed over the border into Poland and have crossed over the border into Romania. And if the Russians cannot control, I mean, there's even been examples of Russian munitions crossing the border into Belarus and bombing stuff. And so if the Russians cannot control the spread of their munitions, it wouldn't be that impossible for any of these countries to argue when shooting these things down 50, 100 miles over the border near Lviv or around Lviv, protecting that area. They could argue, well, these have happened in the past and we're merely protecting our airspace. We're not knocking down rockets around Kiev. We're knocking down rockets around Lviv, which is near our border. And because it's crossed over the border before, we're protecting our border. There is an argument that could be made there. Whether these countries end up making the argument of pulling the trigger, when, of course, there's going to be concerns in Washington of the escalatory potential, is a different story.
Within the range of our partners' air shield, expanding operations using our Ukrainian missiles and drones, as well as investing in expanding their production in Ukraine. Lifting restrictions on the use of long-range.
So if you're curious about who these people are, I'll at least name two that you need to know. The one in the middle, the guy who looks like he's half asleep and a little dead inside, that's Alexander Syrsky. He replaced the previous commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Zelensky, Valery Zelensky. Batko Nash Zelensky was like a popular song here I heard on a few occasions, which stands for Our Father is Zelensky, which is a play on the old Ukrainian nationalist song Batko Nash Bandera Ukraina Ma. So it's a more modernized, less problematic alteration. And to his left is a big Zelensky advisor, Yermak, who, that guy on the left there, he's not liked amongst the vast majority of the Ukrainian public. They see him almost like a kind of worm tongue from Lord of the Rings whispering in Zelensky's ear, and that they don't like a lot of his cronies. But I mean, I've had no interactions with the man, and you can go look up Ukrainian opinion of him if you wanted to hear about him. He does lean into it. If you check out his Twitter, he kind of leans into it. I've seen these pictures he's posted of himself of like he's in a dark corner and it's black and white and it's kind of mysterious. And I think he leans into that kind of like mysterious advisor role quite a lot. He does have a productive relationship with many Western countries, is something that I've been told on multiple occasions from those in the know. What more I can elaborate on that is very little. So we'll just stop it there, and we're getting a little distracted anyway.
Weapons by our partners on the entire territory of Ukraine occupied by Russia and on Russian territory, on military infrastructure, and providing Ukraine with appropriate long-range missiles, drones, and other means of destruction. Providing Ukraine with real-time satellite data and data obtained by other intelligence means. For each of the sub-points of the Victory Plan's defense clause, Ukraine provides its partners with a clear justification of what our goals are, how we are achieving them, and how much this will reduce Russia's ability to continue the war. The defense clause of the plan has a secret part, and only those partners with the relevant military assistance potential have access to it.
I assume these are probably things like specific weapon systems, and what I heard it could be is specific targets, as in, hey, if you give us approval to use long-range strikes, which is one of the things that they did request of the Biden administration's in that Victory Plan meeting, they were like, here's the targets we want to hit. Now, the Biden administration says that 90% of the air power that they used to have within the range of what would be ATACMS strikes, and if they were approved for strikes over the border, the long-range ATACMS strikes, that's already been pulled back. So that means only 10% of that air power is still in range if they make that approval. And so they say that the military benefit is so little and the risk is so high of escalation that it makes it no longer worth it. But now the Zelensky administration has responded. Now, one could say that them waiting so long to make the decision has caused the fact that, it's not as useful as it would have been before. But another counterference that has been made is, okay, but what about the ammo storage? What about the logistics? What about all the other targets that could be in range? Winning a war is not just about having one all-encompassing military victory or one all-encompassing military achievement or allowance or weapon or like Wunderwaffen that's going to win the war. It's about a incremental buildup of different capacities and weapons and abilities that your armies and tools and your tool belt that your army has in order to eventually edge out and become victorious over the enemy. And so one could say that allowance makes the Russians have to pull back that 10% of air power back. It makes them have to pull back the glide bomb storage. It has to make them pull back the ammunition storage. It has to make them stress their logistics more. It means potentially hitting more targets further back on their way. It could mean any number of at least small incremental victories that could, over time, build up into something bigger if partnered with other parts of the victory plan. So, of course, in and of itself, it's not a Wunderwaffen. And if this was just approved and nothing else changed, and we didn't give them enough munitions in order to make a lot of effect of it, then yes, it would probably have very little effect, if any. But it's part of a wider plan. It's part of a wider picture. At least that would be the countenance.
The third point of the plan is deterrence. It also has a secret part. The leaders of the United States, the UK, France, Italy, and Germany have already received it. Some other states will also receive it, and they can give meaning to this well-known concept of deterrence for Ukraine. The Russian leadership acts aggressively only when it is convinced that it will not receive an adequate and destructive response. When Russia knows that there will be a response and understands what that response will be, they choose negotiations and stable coexistence, even with strategic adversaries. This makes it possible to deter Russia from aggression against Ukraine and the whole of Europe. Ukraine proposes to deploy a comprehensive, non-nuclear strategic deterrence package on its soil that will be sufficient to protect Ukraine from any military threat from Russia, and that will narrow Russia's options to the following prospects: either to join an honest diplomatic process to bring the war to a just end, or to be guaranteed to lose the ability to continue the aggressive war as a result of Ukraine's use of the provided deterrence package in accordance with its military objectives. That is, the deterrence package means that Russia either goes into diplomacy or goes to the loss of its war machine. Peace through strength. It works equally well on both.
Generally, if you didn't catch a lot of that, the point that I think is most important is the idea that if we were able to increase, to make it blunt, if you increase Ukraine's capacity to put damage upon the Russians and make them feel the war at home and in Ukraine and grind down their war machine, then the question of them negotiating is not a question of whether they want to negotiate. It's a question of whether they want to keep their military as a fighting force or not, because they just would not be able to continue to afford the war, either through finances because of strikes on oil refineries, or because of the damage and public opposition at home, or just due to the damage done to their military force due to the loss of armor, which has been well documented, and many of the lists are online, documented by Andrew Paturda or Arix or any of the other collectors of these lists, or just the loss of manpower, etc. So basically, damaging the Russians so they don't have much of a choice on whether they want to negotiate or not.
Sides of the Atlantic. And this point can be
Are those grenades on your curtain? Yes. Got this at a military store here. That I was going to search for a medic bag. I needed a new one, and I saw it, and I thought, oh, that'd be a cool, easy background for when I have to stream out of my apartment.
Short in particular by funding within the framework of already concluded security agreements with partners and certain amounts of financial support. The fourth is strategic economic potential. Ukraine has a concentration of natural resources, including critical metals worth trillions of US dollars. These include uranium, titanium, lithium, graphite, and other strategically valuable resources that will strengthen.
Now, the reason he's doing this, it isn't really part of, I think, his argument to the Rada or like convincing them of the plan. This is very much aimed at the West. It's aimed at potential investors. This is the type of stuff that's going to make people say, BlackRock, BlackRock. This is them basically saying Ukraine is a valuable investment. Ukraine, supporting Ukraine is an investment, not only in your security future, but also with future economic potential because of the natural resources, many of which are going to be in high demand in the coming years. Having that in the camp of the West would be useful for their investors and for potential needs for their supply chains.
Strengthen either Russia and its allies or Ukraine and the democratic world in global competition. Deposits of critical resources in Ukraine, along with Ukraine's globally important energy and food production potential, are among Russia's key aggressive goals in the war. And this is our opportunity for growth, Ukraine's economic growth. the economic strengthening of the European Union for the sake of Europe's economic and, in many ways, economic autonomy. And this is an opportunity for the United
That's an interesting pitch to Europe. If you include Ukraine's resources and bountiful, investment opportunities, it helps strengthen European economic autonomy because they have access to resources they would otherwise have to trade elsewhere for. And if it's part of the European Union, you'd be trading for those resources inside EU guidelines.
United States and all partners in the G7 to work with Ukraine, an ally that can provide a return on investment. The economic pillar of our strategy has a secret part that is shared only with certain partners. Ukraine is proposing that the US, together with designated partners, including the EU, of which Ukraine will be a part, and other partners around the world, conclude a special agreement to jointly protect Ukraine's critical resources, jointly invest and use the relevant economic potential. This is also peace through strength, economic power. This is an agreement that will organically complement and strengthen the existing system of economic pressure on Russia, namely all existing sanctions against Russia, oil price caps, export restrictions to Russia, and other pressure measures.
Generally speaking, ramping up sanctions on Russia to pressure the war machine. Tons of Western components have been found within missiles and different weapons used against Ukraine. That's not even talking about the missiles that were turned over from the Budapest Memorandum, but the components of newly crafted stuff post-2022, and that's by the Russians trying to buy these same components through shell companies, through third countries in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. One way you can see this is if you look at graphs from 2022 and prior. In 2021, trade from Kazakhstan's at whatever rate it is, but after in 2022, you see massive uptick in German-Kazakh trade, massive uptick in German-Tajikistan trade. And it's not because there was some big change in Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or any of these countries that made it attract so much investment. It was because these countries were being used as intermediaries to get the same goods that could no longer get to Russia directly through them. There's also, of course, the shadow fleet that Russia's expanded by. I've seen some estimates by like 3 times. It's a bunch of unregistered oil tankers that are transporting other energy products around the world to sell them for billions of dollars to help fund Russia, even though the sanctions have been put in place.
Russia's allies in the world must see that this regime has no economic future, and the 5th point is designed for the post-war period. After this war, Ukraine will have one of the most experienced and largest military contingents. These people are our soldiers who will have real experience of modern warfare, successful experience of using Western weapons, and diverse experience of interaction with NATO troops. This Ukrainian experience should be used to strengthen the alliance defense and security in Europe. This is a worthy mission for our heroes. If the partners agree, we envisage replacing certain military contingents of the US armed forces stationed in Europe with Ukrainian units after the war. Ukrainians have proven that they can be a force that Russian evil cannot overcome. And I am grateful to every partner.
This last 5th point seems to be the idea that Ukraine has developed a ton of military experience from the war, which is true. Its soldiers have developed military experience, its commanders have developed military experience, its technology has been forged, like the FPV drones and the modernizations of the FPV drones and the Sea-Baby drones within this 21st century large-scale war in Europe, the largest war in Europe since World War II, and those lessons will be very valuable to Europe. In fact, the West is already learning lessons through the testing of its weapons in this war zone, and he's basically arguing that these lessons could be useful for all of NATO and many European powers as they face an uncertain 21st century.
To everyone with whom we have discussed this post-war perspective, for their respect for Ukrainians and our ability to be invincible in an alliance with partners. May our joint work under the Victory Plan result in peace for Ukraine as soon as possible. I thank everyone who is with Ukraine. I am proud of all of our people, and I believe in Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
And that is his victory plan. Apparently in DC and in Washington, there were some that did not receive this plan swimmingly, and it was along the lines of, the response was along the lines of like, well, a lot of this is just repackaged stuff we've heard before, which is not that surprising that in a victory plan, you're going to hear demands for support that you've heard from previous news reports, previous demands, because it's not like the problems on the artillery shortage has gone down. It's not like the problem with the need for, interceptors have gone down. These are still problems that need to be addressed. He's just collecting these problems into one plan. He's then saying what he could do with these resources in order to achieve victory and pointing in the general directions that Ukraine needs to punch. And one direction that Zelensky keeps doubling down on is the idea of punching towards Russia, punching into Russia through long-range strikes. And of course, we have the Kursk incursion. So hurt the Russians at home, increase the interceptors and defense and Ukraine's home, grind down the Russians to make them have to negotiate on Ukraine's terms. So that seems to be the general pathway of the plan. Of course, they said that there were many components that were secret and we will not know about probably until well after this war is over, unless there is some massive leak. But yes, we have Ukraine's victory plan out publicly now. There's nothing surprising here. There was no call for concessions that some people were expecting. It seems that he's still standing on 10 toes on the ground on we're going to stand for all of Ukraine's territory. We're going to get it back on top of these new demands, which, I mean, hey, they're not at the negotiating table yet. Him conceding land before they've even sat down might not be the smartest negotiating strategy. At least that might be their viewpoint on it. This might work on France. Dylan, do you think the South Korea will send Ukraine artillery shells now that North Korean troops are in Ukraine? We know that North Korean troops are in Ukraine, almost certainly. At least doing targeting for sure. I have no clue if they're going to send artillery shells just based off of that. If North Korean soldiers start engaging in mass infantry assaults and they start participating in the fighting that Russian soldiers are refusing to, where they're not able to get enough manpower for, so now they have to fill the gaps with North Korean soldiers, I think the likelihood is high. Because at that point, it would be North Korea. They're already directly involved in the war, don't get me wrong. But it would be to such an extent that it would be impossible to ignore as North Korean POWs start getting caught. And we've heard that 18 have already fled to Ukrainian positions, but I haven't seen any pictures, any videos, any confirmation outside of what the Ukrainian government is just saying. And I don't want to just base it off what the Ukrainian government is just saying, because the Ukrainian government has reasons for them to say, hey, look, the North Koreans, all of America's enemies are fighting us. You can smash them up right here, There's an incentive, so I'm not just going to take it at face value from the Ukrainian armed forces or Ukrainian spokespeople. There are legal reasons South Korea cannot send munitions to Ukraine, so they sold some to the U.S. and they sent them to the U.S. Yeah, no, the way Ukraine got South Korean munitions before, they got 500,000 155 millimeter shells, was by sending to America, and America sent it to Ukraine, because in South Korea there's a law where you cannot send munitions directly to a war zone, even though they're one of the largest arms manufacturers in the world, and they're on track, according to their government, to try to hit the fourth largest arms manufacturer in the world by, I believe, 2027 or 2030. I forget which projection they wanted. Currently, they're the fifth. And a lot of that production is artillery shells, which Ukraine desperately needs. Hey, Ghost of Nestor Machno, thank you for the $10. Only real ones remember the Gravel campaign. It's how I first heard of you. You're an excellent activist and broadcaster. You give better commentary than any of the mainstream or alt media. Oh, thank you, Ghost of Nestor Machno. My goodness.